and we would all be wise to heed it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I want to congratulate the Republican leader for his remarks, and I think without being presumptuous, I can express the hope that all of us feel that he will help us restore the Senate to the role that the American people need for it to play in this country. There's a new history of the Senate, the American Senate, written by Neil McNeil, the late Neil McNeil, who wrote the best book about the House of Representatives, and the former historian of the Senate. I suspect this book is likely to become the best chronicle of this body. And it speaks of the United States Senate as the one touch of authentic genius in the American political system. And it needs to be restored to that position. The Republican leader is absolutely right. This doesn't require a change of rules. This requires a change of behavior. Some behavior on our part on this side of the aisle, but a great deal of behavior on the part of whomever the majority leader of the United States Senate is, because that is the person who sets the agenda. And the debate for this year really is, will this year be the end of the United States Senate, which is what the distinguished majority leader said it would be if we ever changed the rules in a way that allowed the majority to cut off debate, or will it be the year in which the United States Senate is restored to that role of authentic genius in the American political system? I'm hopeful it can be that way. It would suit me fine if it started tomorrow, because it could start as quickly as tomorrow, because it causes no change of rules, only a change in behavior, only a change in behavior. And that can happen as soon as tomorrow. But we know that it can happen after November. If we have 6 more Republican senators on this side, and we've heard your commitment on the floor today about how the committees can operate, about how amendments should operate. We've heard that before in our own meetings in private lunches. And I'm glad you took the occasion in this really eloquent way to say to the American people and to all of us what we expect out of service in the United States Senate. I had the privilege, as the senator from Kentucky did, of seeing Senator Mansfield as the leader of this body. I haven't served in the Senate as long as others who are here, but I came here, it seems hard to believe, 47 years ago as a young aide to a senator who eventually became the majority leader of the Senate, Howard Baker. Those were the days of Mansfield and Dirksen. Those were the days when Barry Goldwater and John Tower and Hubert Humphrey would engage in hours of debates here and hug each other at the end of their discussion. Those were the days when the majority leader would offer an amendment of a Republican senator whose amendment had been denied unfairly, he thought. Those were the days of committees who did their work, and Republicans and Democrats who came to the floor and together offered bills. I saw the Senate in the 70s when I came back and Senator Baker was the Republican leader, and I saw it in the 80s and the 90s. I saw what the Republican leaders said. Let's take the Panama Canal debate. Senator Baker, Senator Byrd, they would run this Senate in the way the Republican leader suggested, in the way most majority leaders have suggested. They would come to the floor, they would put a bill on the floor that a Republican and a Democratic senator agreed on. Let's say it's Senator McCain, Senator Levin, Senator Inhofe, Senator Levin. They would ask for amendments. They might get 300 amendments. They would then ask for unanimous consent to cut off all the amendments, and of course they would get it because everyone had a chance to have his or her amendment. And then within that unanimous consent agreement would be a procedure for how to vote on them, and they'd say, we're here on Monday and we're going to finish this week, just as the Republican leader has said. And it didn't work perfectly. There was a senator from Alabama, and then there was a senator from Ohio, and they did all they could to put glue in the works, but the majority leader had all the tools he needed to run the Senate in that way. Everybody got a say. Everybody got a say. And Senator Byrd, in his last remarks before the Rules Committee, and I was there to hear it, said we should never tear down this necessary fence. He meant the filibuster that protects us from an excess of the executive and runaway popular passions. But he said one other thing. Senator Byrd said in 2010 that any majority leader had the tools he needed already in the rules to operate this Senate in the way it should be run. So we need a change of behavior, not of changes of the rules. And one more example that goes to the point that the senator from Kentucky made. How important is it to be able to offer an amendment? Well, I mean, the people of Tennessee, serving in the Senate today is like being invited to join the Grand Ole Opry and not being allowed to sing. I mean, people of Tennessee expect me to have an opinion on their behalf about Obamacare, about Iran, about all of the issues, about how do we help unemployed Americans get a job, about the minimum wage or the lack of. They expect me to have a say about that, not because they want to hear me, but because I'm their voice. Senator Byrd wrote eloquently about that in his book. He talked about the Panama Canal debate. Now, there was a tough debate. I mean, they didn't just bring the Panama Canal Treaty in here and plop it on the floor and say we're going to vote on it next Monday. You think it would have gotten 67 votes? No, it would not have gotten 67 votes. How did it get 67 votes? Well, the Democratic leader, Senator Byrd, and the Republican leader, Senator Baker, read David McCullough's book and changed their minds. And they both supported the treaty, and then they allowed every single amendment and reservation that anybody wanted to offer. Senator Byrd wrote, many of those were killer amendments. In other words, they were designed to kill the treaty. But he said, we allowed every one of them, 200 of them. He said, we beat them all. We tabled them or defeated them all. But if we had not allowed that to happen, and the senators hadn't had a chance to have their say, we'd have never ratified the treaty. So, Mr. President, I know there may be others who want to speak, but we've gone down a trail in the last several years, just a few years, that I never thought imaginable. We have 43 new members of the Senate, 43 members of the Senate who are in their first term, plus one, the senator from Indiana, who's in his first term but served before, so he has a broader view of this. Those senators have never seen this body operate properly. Most of them are on the other side. So it's not anybody's fault that this is happening, but this is not the way the United States Senate earned the reputation as the most unique deliberative body in the world. No one would recognize it as that today. No one would recognize it as the authentic touch of creative genius in the American system of government. So my hope would be that the Democratic leader would recognize this and have a change of behavior tomorrow, or maybe later this afternoon. But if he does not, I hope the American people take this seriously and take it into account when they cast their votes in November, and put 6 more Republicans on this side of the aisle so a Republican leader can restore this body to the luster that it deserves and the American people deserve as the authentic touch of genius in the American political system. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Baldwin.
So the Senate is in a quorum call right now. We are not expecting this to last much longer. Lawmakers have been debating a bill extending unemployment insurance for 3 months. Benefits ended at the end of December. This measure would extend them until March. The main stumbling block for Republicans is how the bill would be paid for. Now, a short time ago, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell came to the floor, and he was talking about Senate rules. We are expecting to hear more about this from Senate Republicans who are upset about the state of the Senate. More than 30 senators were on the floor at the time Senator McConnell was speaking. And again, we are expecting more about the Senate rules and how Republicans are upset about this as the day goes on. Again, the pending business in the Senate is unemployment benefits. We could see votes on the measure this afternoon.
President.
The Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we just heard a very eloquent speech given by the Republican leader here in the Senate about the history of the Senate, the role that it's played in our democracy, its past, and what could be its future if we can restore it to where it once was. The leader talked a lot about things that used to be taken for granted around here, the committee process working and functioning where committees actually reported legislation out, worked on it, brought it to the floor, an amendment process where when legislation got to the floor it could actually be debated, amendments offered, amendments voted on, individual senators having the opportunity to offer amendments, and to be the voices that our people elect us to be here in the United States Senate. And unfortunately, in many respects, the current Senate, the wheels have come off. We find ourselves with a process there. Typically, the amendment tree is filled, which blocks amendments from being offered, and perhaps the best factoid with regard to that is that there have only been 4 Republican amendments voted on since July. A half a year in the United States Senate. 4 Republican amendments voted on in the United States Senate. Now, in any institution where you have any form of open debate and open amendment process, you're going to have a lot more votes than that. And I think that's very telling about where we are. I was here as a young staffer back in 1985 and 1986. At that time, Senator Bob Dole was the majority leader in the United States Senate. It was a very different place. The boss I worked for, I worked on some issues for him, and he had his opportunities, as did other senators at that time, to come down here in the Senate, offer amendments, to be able to speak out on behalf of his constituents on issues that were important to them, important to him. And that's something that has become a bygone era. And I also had the opportunity prior to being elected to the Senate to serve in the other body, the House of Representatives, where things are very structured. You have a rules committee that basically regulates what legislation comes to the floor, what amendments will be made in order, how much time is allowed for debate on each amendment. That is the way that institution was structured. The Senate, as Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, pointed out earlier, is a very different institution by design. Our founders wanted it to be different. And Senator Alexander, in his remarks, talked about an author who described it as a touch of authentic genius, the United States Senate. And we've gotten very far away from that in terms of its historic role and certainly what should be its role today as we debate major policy, major legislation that impacts over 300 million Americans. And so, Mr. President, today I come to the floor to discuss an issue that was debated here a few years ago, which is an example, a byproduct, if you will, of a one-party rule where a big piece of legislation is jammed through in a partisan way, and that's Obamacare. Now, my colleagues on the Democrat side recently have spent a lot of time talking about income inequality. And after 5 years of stagnation in the Obama economy and an ever-growing gap between rich and poor, I think it's high time for us to be talking about that. But part of that discussion, a critical part that Democrats don't want to have, has to be the ways in which Obamacare is contributing to the problem. As the last few months have made clear, Obamacare is making things worse for millions of Americans. Huge premium increases and soaring out-of-pocket costs mean that families will have to take money that they would have used to buy their first home or pay for a child's college and use it to pay for health care instead. Crippling mandates on employers mean fewer jobs available for the unemployed and reduced hours for workers. And as if the economic problems caused by the law weren't enough, recent weeks have made clear that the quality of care is likely to diminish thanks to the President's health care law. Contrary to the President's promise that you could keep the doctor that you had and liked, millions of Americans are discovering that they will be losing their doctors this year and that their choice of replacement is limited. Why? Well, because Obamacare provides an incentive for insurers to limit the pool of doctors, and I might add hospitals as well, that you can visit. The President's health care law placed a number of new burdens on insurers, from new taxes to a new requirement that everyone with pre-existing conditions be covered at the same rate as healthy individuals. On top of that, the law gives states the authority to tell insurance companies how much they're allowed to charge for their health plans. As a result, insurance companies are facing huge new cost increases with very few ways to cover those costs. So many companies have chosen the one cost control measure still available to them, and that's limiting their networks of doctors and hospitals. In California, for example, as a Time magazine article recently reported, Blue Shield offered doctors a choice: be reimbursed up to 30% less for medical care or be excluded from the network. The Time article, which was entitled "Keeping Your Doctor Under Obamacare is No Easy Feat," goes on to report, and I quote, that among the providers who declined to accept the lower rates were some of the state's most prestigious and expensive hospitals, including Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles and hospitals affiliated with the University of California, end quote. There's a reason these hospitals are prestigious and expensive. They are on the cutting edge of medical research and offering breakthrough treatments that are unavailable at many other hospitals. People come to these hospitals when other treatments have failed, and they often find hope. But these kinds of hospitals, world-class, cutting-edge facilities, are the hospitals most likely to be excluded from exchange plans. Time reports, and again I quote, a December 13th McKinsey study of 20 U.S. metropolitan areas found that 2/3 of ACA plans analyzed had narrow or ultra-narrow networks, with at least 30% of top hospitals excluded for coverage, end quote. The consequences of these narrow or ultra-narrow networks are many. First, of course, these networks may not include your doctor. If you've been forced off your health plan into a new private plan or exchange plan, your new plan may not cover the doctor you've been seeing for years, the doctor you like and who knows your medical history. This is detrimental to any patient, but for someone who is being treated for a serious illness, this could be devastating. Switching doctors midstream while being treated for cancer or other serious illness could have a disastrous impact on the quality of the care the patient receives. In addition to losing the doctor that you have and like, these narrow networks also mean that your choice of a replacement will be limited, at times severely limited, and that the same quality of care may simply not be available in the new network. Still, another consequence, as Time points out, is the distance that you may have to travel to get to your doctor or hospital. Excluding hospitals from an insurance network may not present a huge travel problem for urban residents, the article notes, but residents in rural areas may be forced to drive a long way to reach a hospital in their network. Time quotes Kaiser Family Foundation senior fellow Karen Politz, who notes that exchange customers in central Maine have to travel as far as Portland to reach a covered hospital. That could be a 2.5-hour drive. Not exactly ideal if you're, say, having a baby or a serious health crisis. But let's suppose that you do somehow find an affordable plan on the exchanges that does cover your doctor. You still may not be able to get care. A recent Fox News article focused on experts' warnings that the health exchange system may start to look a lot like Medicaid, the federal health insurance program for the poor. Like the exchanges, Medicaid features narrow provider networks, as many doctors either refuse Medicare patients altogether or limit the number that they see because of Medicaid's low reimbursements. So what is the result? Medicaid patients generally face worse outcomes than patients with private insurance. They wait longer for doctors when they can get in to see them at all. A survey published in the New England Journal of Medicine found that 66% of children on Medicaid were denied appointments with specialists compared to just 11% of children covered by private insurance. Patients on Medicaid are more likely to suffer complications and spend longer in the hospital. And they are more likely to die from cancer, surgical complications, and other problems. Unfortunately, this could soon be the future of those forced into narrow networks on the exchanges. Patients will be denied access to top doctors and hospitals and will be forced to compete with other patients for access to a limited number of health care providers. Even those Americans whose plans cover their preferred doctors will not necessarily be able to get in to see their doctor if he's forced to start limiting the number of exchange patients that he takes. Analysts, Fox News warns, and I quote again, emphasize that having health insurance won't necessarily translate into access to health care, end quote. Now let me repeat that, Mr. President. Analysts emphasize that having health insurance won't necessarily translate into access to health care. This is what the grand promise of Obamacare has come to. Even those who have managed to make their way through the broken exchange websites and find an affordable plan still may not be able to get health care. Is this the rosy future that we were promised? Obamacare was supposed to fix our health care system. The President promised that it would reduce costs and expand access to care. Every American was supposed to benefit. Instead, millions of Americans have lost their plans. Health insurance costs have soared. There are parents who now can't afford to insure their children, and cancer patients who are losing their doctors and hospitals. Those few who have gained coverage are facing a system well on its way to becoming a copy of Medicaid. Mr. President, surely we can do better than this. We have got to do better than this. It is time to abandon the failed Obamacare experiment and move on to real health care reform. Mr. President, we can do that. We should do that. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of the Truth in Settlements Act. This bipartisan legislation, which I introduced earlier today with my colleague from Oklahoma, Dr. Coburn, will help the public hold federal agencies accountable for the settlements they make with corporate wrongdoers. I'm honored to partner with Dr. Coburn on this bill. In his decade in the Senate, he has been a leader in the fight for greater government transparency. Dr. Coburn and I do not agree on every issue, but we strongly agree that sunlight is a critical component of good government. That is the motivation behind the Truth in Settlements Act, and I'm proud to fight alongside Dr. Coburn to advance this legislation. When companies break the law, federal enforcement agencies are responsible for holding them accountable. In nearly every instance, agencies choose to resolve cases through settlements rather than going to a public trial. The government agencies defend this practice by arguing that their eagerness to settle is in the best interests of the American people. But their actions paint a very different picture. If agencies were truly confident that these settlements were good deals for the public, they would be enthusiastic about publicly disclosing all of the key details of those agreements. Hang it right out there so everyone can see what a great job they did on behalf of the American people. So is that what they do? No. Instead, time after time, agencies do the opposite, hiding critical details about their settlements in the fine print, or worse, hiding those details entirely out of public view. Copies of these agreements, or even the basic facts about the agreements, are not easily accessible online. Many agencies regularly deem agreements confidential without any public explanation. When agencies do make public statements about these agreements, they often trumpet large dollar amounts of money for the taxpayers. What they don't trumpet is that the companies often pay dramatically less than this sticker price through credits for engaging in routine activities or through potentially huge tax deductions. Add up all of these tricks and you end up with a predictable result. Too often, the American people only see what the agencies want them to see about these agreements. These hidden details can make all the difference. When you dig below the surface, settlements that seem tough and fair can end up looking like sweetheart deals. For example, last year, federal regulators entered into a settlement with 13 mortgage servicers accused of illegal foreclosure practices. Now, the sticker price on the settlement was $8.5 billion. That's a really nice headline. But $5.2 billion of the settlement was in the form of credits, not in cash outlays. These credits were described in the government's press release as covering what they called, quote, loan modifications and forgiveness of deficiency judgments. So what does that mean? Well, it turns out that the servicers could rack up those credits by forgiving mere fractions of large unpaid loans. So for example, if a servicer wrote down $15,000 of a $500,000 unpaid loan balance, that servicer doesn't just get a $15,000 credit for the amount they wrote down, they get a credit for the whole $500,000, the full value of the loan. That method of calculating credits, buried in the fine print, could end up cutting by more than half the overall value of the $8.5 billion settlement. Another way to hide the ball is to omit the upfront determination and disclosure of whether the settlement will be tax deductible. Several years ago, the Justice Department announced a $385 million settlement with Fresenius Medical Care for allegedly defrauding Medicare and other health programs for years. When the agreement was originally announced, the Justice Department touted the sticker price as the agency's largest civil recovery to date in a health care fraud case. But the DOJ didn't say a word about the tax treatment. The agency's failure to even consider that issue was a very costly mistake. By the time the company finished claiming all of its tax deductions from the settlement, it ended up paying $100 million less than originally advertised. In other words, the taxpayers picked up more than a quarter of the tab. It takes a lot of digging around to uncover these unflattering details, but at least it was possible to do so in these cases because of public information about these two agreements. For settlements that are kept confidential, the public is completely in the dark. So just last year, Wells Fargo agreed to pay the Federal Housing Finance Agency $335 million for allegedly fraudulent sales of mortgage-backed securities to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's about 6% of what J.P. Morgan paid in a public settlement with FHFA to address very similar claims. So in what ways did the actions of Wells Fargo differ from those of J.P. Morgan? Well, we'll never know, because the J.P. Morgan settlement is public, but the much smaller Wells Fargo settlement is confidential. The American people deserve better. Government enforcement agencies work for us, not for the companies they regulate. Agencies should not be able to cut bad deals and then hide their embarrassing details. The public deserves to know what's going on. The Truth in Settlements Act requires transparency. It requires agencies making public statements about their settlements to include explanations of how companies get credits and whether the wrongdoers will be eligible for tax breaks for their settlement payments. The bill also requires agencies to post text and basic information about their settlements online. And while the legislation permits confidential settlements, it requires agencies to disclose how frequently they are invoking confidentiality and to explain their reasons for doing so. If we expect government agencies to hold companies accountable for breaking the law, then we, the public, must be able to hold agencies accountable for enforcing the law. We can't do that if we're kept in the dark. The Truth in Settlements Act shines a light on these agencies' decisions, and it gives the American people a chance to hold agencies accountable for fairly and effectively enforcing our laws. I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander. Majority Leader.
Is the Senate in a quorum call?
It is.
I ask unanimous consent that it be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the Republican leader and I don't agree on everything, but we do agree on some things. And there is one thing that no one can dispute that we agree on, and that's our love of baseball. We both love baseball season. It gives us an opportunity when we go home after working here to turn on TV and watch a few innings of a baseball game. For some people, baseball is a real slow, boring opportunity to watch people moving slowly. But Senator McConnell and I love it, and we talk about baseball. We love the Nationals, and I have a great affection for the National because of Bryce Harper, the Las Vegas athlete. The reason I mention that, Mr. President, is today Nevada's greatest baseball hero, in fact, one of the greatest baseball heroes, not of Nevada, but of all time, was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Greg Maddux is an extremely nice man, a man of humility. I've gone out to dinner with him and his lovely wife a few times. I know his brother well, who was also a professional baseball player. And he would be the first to tell you when he was playing baseball and today about how average he was. I'm not a great athlete, but Mr. President, one of the best of all time. He started his career with the Chicago Cubs and went on to win 355 professional Major League Baseball games and 4 consecutive Cy Young Awards. Now, today he received almost 98% of all the votes cast. the second highest tally in the history of Hall of Fame voting. So I congratulate this good man in the honor that he received so deservedly. I repeat, a man of humility. A man who has probably the greatest control in the history of baseball of being able to throw a ball to a spot that he wanted. Not a big man. That's an understatement. Not a big man. But he was precise in where he could throw that baseball. And I have such fond memories of Greg Maddox. The last election was kind of a hard election I had. So I called Greg, called him on his cell phone. I said, Greg, I want you to be a Republican for Reed for me. Would you do that? He said, I'll do that. I said, what are you doing? I said, I'm playing golf. He said, I'm playing golf. I said, can you break 80? And he said, if you leave me alone, I can break 70. So, Mr. President, fine man, have great affection for him and his family. And I'm sure this is one thing that Senator McConnell and I agree on. Mr. President, this afternoon, the Republican leader came to the floor to explain about the minority's ability to offer amendments. On this occasion, offer amendments on the 3-month extension of the legislation now before this body. But you know, it's interesting. During the Republican leader's remarks, there wasn't a word uttered about jobs, about unemployment compensation, or the economy. Not a word. So it's very clear what went on here today with my Republican colleagues. Remember, the Republican leader came here and the Republican senators came and sat here with him. It's impossible for my Republican colleagues to explain to the American people their callous opposition to the plight of 1.3 million Americans. About 20,000 of them live in Nevada. 2 very fine senators, on a bipartisan basis, have this legislation before this body. Jack Reed of Rhode Island, who is tied as we speak. Rhode Island is tied with Nevada for the highest unemployment in the country. The other senator is my friend, Republican senator from Nevada, junior senator from Nevada, Dean Heller. An important move they made on behalf of their states and the American people. Republicans, though, Mr. President, don't want to talk about the problems facing the middle class as evidenced by what went on here this afternoon. They don't want to talk, these Republicans, about the solutions to falling wages and job shortages. Mr. President, in America today, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is being squeezed. During the last 30 years, the top 1% wealth and income has increased by triple numbers. Triple. But what has happened to the middle class during that same 30 years? Their wages have gone down 10%. Tripling to going down 10%. So they don't want to talk about this. They don't, and that's why they plan to vote against extension of these emergency unemployment insurance benefits. The vast majority of them voted to not even let us get on the bill and have a debate. But a few stepped forward and said, no, we should have a debate on this, and a debate we are having. My Republican colleagues are looking for a distraction, a diversion, a phony process argument to steal attention away from their unconscionable stand on the issues that matter most to the middle class. Mr. President, this issue of unemployment insurance isn't wasn't developed by some political science professor from Harvard or Yale or Stanford. It's something to help people who are in desperate shape. So, Mr. President, I repeat, they're looking for a distraction, a process argument, to steal attention away from their unconscionable stand on the issues that matter most to the middle class. You have to give them credit. They're doing their best to divert attention away from this issue. This is opposition, and it's cold-hearted. to extending unemployment benefits. It's a very tough position to defend, especially when Republicans around America support what Heller and Reed, Rhode Island, are trying to do. Democrats support it, independents. But Republicans in Congress don't. And they've said so. Republicans' complaint that the majority never allows the minority to offer amendments is, Mr. President, false. It's not true. It's another diversion. During my tenure as Majority Leader, there have been volumes of stuff written about the obstruction we've had with my Republican colleagues during the last 5 years with the Obama administration. Think of the obstruction that took place when Barack Obama decided to run for re-election. Well, that was a little interesting because the Republican leader said his #1 goal as a United States Senator and a leader of the Republicans is to make sure he wasn't re-elected. Well, he fell real short on that because he was elected overwhelmingly. So during that period of time, obstruction, 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 obstruction. And after he was re-elected, it continued. During my tenure as Majority Leader, the Senate has voted on minority amendments at a higher rate than it did during either of my Republican predecessors. And one of the largest number of minority amendments probably in the history of the Senate. But let's just talk about Republican Leader Frist, Republican Leader Trent Lott. Both friends of mine. I still am in touch with them all the time. They're people I will always admire and have great respect for. Since I've been leader, 7 out of 10 amendments on which the Senate has voted have been, Mr. President, Republican amendments. Under Senator Frist's leadership, certainly there weren't that many, I'll tell you that were offered by the minority. Under Senator Lott's leadership, only 54% of the amendments considered by the Senate were offered by the minority. And during my leadership of the 111th Congress, minority amendments represented a greater share of all amendment votes than during any single Congress during either Leader Frist or Leader Lott's tenure. Facts. In fact, often the minority is prevented from offering amendments. Why? Their own senators won't allow amendments. How many times has a presiding officer and others come to this floor and want to offer amendment, objection on the other side? Because they want to offer an amendment that has nothing to do with anything that we're debating on the floor at a given time. Last year, just a handful of Republican senators held up any legislation. The best example was the legislation we tried to do dealing with energy efficiency. Energy efficiency. Couldn't get it done because of Republican obstruction. Often a particular Republican will prevent any senator from offering an amendment unless he gets a vote on what he wants voted on first. A little unusual. So let's not revise history. Let's talk about history as I know it and as the books report how we should know it, what the facts are in the congressional record. We know how, under my friend, the Republican leader's leadership, there have been obstruction in the way of filibusters. You know, Mr. President, filibusters is not some right that was placed in the Constitution. It's a privilege that was granted under the Senate rules, and that has been abused big time. Their obstructions continue to be unprecedented over the last 5 years. Half of all filibuster waged in the history of the country, that's 230 plus years. Half of them have been waged against President Obama's nominations. Half of them in 5 years compared to 230 years. Last year, Republicans mounted the first ever filibuster of a Secretary of Defense. Now, by the way, a former Republican senator. They even filibustered him. So I understand Republicans don't want to talk about how we can create jobs, how we can boost the economy. or any of the other issues that matter most to the middle class. And I understand the Republicans are struggling to explain turning their backs on 1.3 million unemployed Americans. But I do wish they would stop trying to justify their opposition to helping Americans in need with false claims and distortions of the truth. Finally, as I leave the floor, Mr. President, I prefer not to pay for this emergency situation where we have long-term unemployed. This is an emergency and should be considered accordingly and should not be paid for in the normal course around here. Now, we believe in reducing the debt. In the Senate chambers with me now is someone that I had the pleasure of appointing to the Bowles-Simpson Commission, the senior senator from the state of Illinois, Assistant Majority Leader. He worked hard on that. But, Mr. President, we haven't followed Bowles-Simpson as a Bible, but it's certainly been a guide that we have followed. And while we could have done better, we've done pretty good. We're approaching having reduced the debt by some $3 trillion right now as we speak. We could reduce it another $1 trillion if we could get comprehensive immigration reform done. Now, the goal of Bowles-Simpson was $4 trillion. So when I say this is something that hasn't been paid for ordinarily in the past, that's true. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we're going to continue to work on this side of the aisle, reducing the debt. But I do hear that some of my Republican colleagues want to pay for this. I disagree with them, but that's what they want to do. So far, all we've heard from Republicans pay for is this. Take a big whack out of Obamacare. There are 9 million people, approaching 10 million now, who benefit from Obamacare. So they want to damage every one of those 9+ million people. Or they've got another one. Go after children with the child tax credit. Those are their two pay-fors at this point. A little scary, I would think. So we're waiting for Republican suggestions how to pay for the full-year extension of employment insurance. Let's hear from them. How do they want to pay for it? They say they want to pay for it. Let's hear what they want to do.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I want to thank the Majority Leader for his comments, and I'll be very brief because I know the Senator from Iowa has a statement that he wants to make. Let me just say that the statement made on the floor earlier this afternoon by the Republican leader never once addressed the issue pending before the Senate. Pending before the Senate is an emergency unemployment insurance bill that will provide benefits to 1.3 million Americans who are out of work and for 8 days now have been receiving no assistance whatsoever. Imagine the struggles they are facing. That's why we called this bill first when we returned from our holiday recess. We consider it a priority. We were heartened yesterday when 6 Republicans joined us to move this bill forward. It really gave us hope that we were going to do something to get this done in a timely way to help a lot of deserving people all across the United States. And we hope today when the Republican leader from Kentucky came to the floor that he would address the urgency and necessity of this bill. He did not. As Senator Reid has said, he wanted to talk about the Senate rules. The Senate rules are important, make no mistake, but they're certainly not as important as providing essential benefits, essential relief and help to 1.3 million unemployed Americans, people who are trying to pay their utility bills, avoid eviction, put gas in the car, and go out and find a job. That is a higher priority, and I had hoped that the Republican leader would address it. Instead, he wants to talk about the rules. What the senator from Nevada, our majority leader, has said is a matter of record. It is still amazing to consider this. Nearly half of all the filibusters waged on nominations in the history of the United States of America have been waged under the leadership of Republican Senator McConnell during the Obama presidency. More than half. In the history of the United States, 168 nominees have been filibustered. 82 occurred under the leadership of the Republican senator from Kentucky under the Obama administration. In the history of the United States, 23 district court nominees have been filibustered. In our entire history, 20 have been filibustered under the leadership of the Republican senator from Kentucky during the Obama administration. 20 out of 23. More than half of all the nominations that have been filibustered under this Senate Republican leadership. Is there any wonder why the rules needed to be changed? And we look at the wait time of those who finally get out of committee and sit on a calendar waiting indefinitely. It breaks my heart to think of the fine women and men who are willing to offer their lives in public service, go through extensive background checks, make the necessary personal sacrifices, and languish on our calendar for no earthly reason. In the end, many of them have been approved with overwhelming votes, and yet they've been subjected to these incessant Republican filibusters. The case involving our colleague, Congressman Mel Watt of North Carolina, is one of the most egregious. It's the first time, I believe, since 1843 that a sitting member of Congress has faced a filibuster in the United States Senate when appointed to a presidential nomination. Finally, we broke that after the rules changed, and I was heartened to see that Congressman Watt was sworn in yesterday to this position dealing with America's housing challenges. But that was an example of an outrageous filibuster against a colleague, a fellow member of Congress, a member of the United States House of Representatives. The coup de grace, of course, was the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals when we offered 3 well-qualified nominees to fill obvious vacancies on that court, and they were stopped by Republican filibusters, one after the other, without any complaint about their qualifications. Well qualified for this position to serve on the D.C. Circuit Court. And it wasn't until Senator Reid led us in changing the Senate rules that we finally found this necessary relief. Mr. President, it's time for us to return to the issue at hand. Pending before the Senate is emergency unemployment benefits for 1.3 million Americans. As important as a rules debate may be to some in this chamber, there is nothing more important than to deal with this in a timely way. I hope the Republicans will take the advice of the leader that he gave at the end of his remarks. Produce for us your pay-for, if that's the course that you want to follow, for us to pay for these unemployment benefits for the coming year. We're waiting for your response, and in the meantime, I hope that some will come forward and join us in what has traditionally been a bipartisan effort to help those in America seeking work. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
First, Mr. President, I want to thank our leader and our assistant leader for their great leadership and for their eloquence here on the floor today, and for correctly